Hi, welcome back, everyone. This is your friend Greedy Fanfics, bringing you another fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the second part of What If Deku Had mimicking Quirk. All credit for this story goes to Mimas, so please support them by checking out the link in the description for more details. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more content like this. Now, let's get into the fanfic. Izuku's eyes felt heavy and sticky, like they were glued shut. It was hard to force them to peel open without using his hand to physically lift the lids, yet he still tried, and his efforts were greeted with a white mound of cloth. It took a second of slow processing, and a heavy blink to realize he's in a bed. An actual bed. With a mattress and a pillow and everything. He was so tired he didn't want to move, but the blankets, and the smell of things that make his nose itch with a slight burn drove him to lift his head in an effort to get away from it. It was a futile effort as the entire room, wherever this is drowning in the chemical stench, and instead, his eyes settled on the light-colored walls of the room around him. A room he quickly recognized by its furniture as an infirmary. Well, that explains the unpleasant smell and the impossibility of getting away from it. It's not so bad the longer he breathes, his nose adjusting to the sting, though it still makes him want to sneeze and bury his nose in the blanket and breathe through the cloth. Finally awake, I see. Izuku jumped at the unexpected voice and his nerves tingled, pouring anxiety through his body like soy sauce over rice. Don't fret, dearie. An elderly voice soothed. You fainted from Quirk exhaustion. It seems your last transformation was a little too much for you. Izuku caught his reflection in the glass of a standing case full of medicine bottles and tiny vials of unknown things. So he's a rabbit then. That's unusual. He hasn't done this transformation before. He sort of expected to be a cat after passing out. His nose twitched and began to wiggle, his ears twisting as he adjusted to the sounds and finally got his brain online to think. He can't believe he actually managed an elephant transformation. But if he didn't even have the energy left over to be a cat afterwards, never mind a human, just how close did he cut it? He went from holding a tiger transformation for something like half an hour, to an elephant for a few minutes, and ended up as something as small as a tiny rabbit afterwards. That's kind of scary. He's never pushed it so far before. He's never tried to hold onto a shift when it reached the dizzy mark. He's always let go immediately. But what if they hadn't been out of danger yet and he had tried to? What would happen? He's not sure he wants to know. Oh, but he does. He shook his head. This is not the time. Bringing himself back to the situation at hand, his vision is a little odd. There's less dimension than he's used to, almost like the world is in 2D, and he can see way more than he's used to. It's like looking through a super wide-angle camera. He can almost see behind himself. It was very disorienting for the first few seconds, but just as with the tiger, he adjusted quickly, like it was natural, and it was easy to spot the old woman in a lab coat out of one eye, watching him. Curious that you would turn into something else, rather than revert to human. Assuming you were human to begin with. Izuku stared at the old woman. It took a minute to recognize her, and he did right as she introduced herself. I'm Recovery Girl, dearie. The nurse on staff here at UA. It seems the number you listed as your contact on the admission form was unavailable, so we had no choice but to wait for you to wake up. A spike of panic shot through him before he remembered he doesn't actually have to answer like this, which means he doesn't have to worry about lying just yet, or that his face will give him away. Instead, he just nodded. The exaggerated motion feeling a little weird like this. It feels like he's learned more about his quirk in this one day than he has since the first month he got it, but this vision stuff is new. Like new, not just a notice new. He briefly noticed it after his first transformation into a cat, but the change was minimal, just seeing better in the dark, but his vision hasn't been affected by other things like what colors he can see or his range of vision before. As a tiger everything was more yellow and greenish, but not that different. Now, he can see almost the entire room around him, but, hold on, it wasn't like that when he first woke up. And he knows for a fact that rabbits can't see reds, but he can very clearly see that exact color around the room, and even shades of pink in Recovery Girl's costume. "What's going on? If you're able to, would you mind turning back, dearie?" Izuku processed the words for a long second before quickly nodding and shuffling under the white covers, nose twitching as the smell of the room is much more tolerable under here, just like he thought. Soft green fur and big ears began to recede, tingles racing through his tiny, tough muscles as his body grew, and a wave of dizziness hit him like he'd stood up too fast. But once his skin finished settling into place, he was able to prop himself up onto his elbows in the bed. "So sorry, my mom works during the day, so that's probably why she didn't answer." Izuku bit his lip, burning in self-conscious anxiety because his stutter hasn't been this bad since, well, ever, and the fact he now has nothing but a thin white blanket, thankfully not see-through in the slightest despite being the color most notorious for such a thing, and the guilt swarming his heart like a hive of angry bees for lying isn't helping. He prepared for this to happen before he even wrote that number down on the application, knowing the stubborn old man refuses to answer calls from numbers he doesn't recognize, no matter how many times they call. If he could have, he would have left the section blank, but it was a required field of the admission form, and he was not about to put down Fukudashi's number. He would sooner put down his social workers than his legal guardians. "I see." Recovery Girl nodded in understanding. It wasn't uncommon for parents to be working while their kids took the exam. After all, it isn't like the sports festival where people can come and watch. The exam is closed to the public and is strictly for UA's teaching staff and board members. Even pro heroes are no exception, and that rule is exactly what Izuku was counting on. He stiffened as the gray-haired woman's eyes narrowed on his face before trailing down to his very visible collarbones and shoulder. Suddenly he's thankful for the stubborn baby fat in his cheeks that keep his face from looking gaunt and sickly, even if it makes him look younger than he is. His height does not help with looking his age, but everything has its advantages. That being said, it does nothing for the rat's nest that is his hair. He tried to cut it a little, mostly out of anxiety while he was preparing for exam day, but it was very choppy. The only saving grace is that it's curly, and you can't really tell. He subconsciously shuffled further under the blanket, and Recovery Girl smiled warmly at him. If she had anything to say about him, she kept it to herself, and as nervous as that makes him, he couldn't be more grateful for not having to come up with an on-the-spot excuse for his thinness. "Well, dearie, your clothes are beside you on the table there. I'll let you get dressed. Then we'll get a meal and some fluids in you to handle that exhaustion and see if we can't get a hold of your mother one more time before we send you on your way, all right?" Izuku's cheeks turned bright red as his stomach growled at the mention of food and avoided her eyes as he bowed his head stiffly. Thank you." She closed the curtain for him, and he let out a silent breath of relief at being allowed to dress in peace and privacy, and thankfully he hadn't torn his clothes. They're brand new from the cheap racks at the donation center, and he spent all of what little money he had on them just for today's exam. It's too suspicious for a 15-year-old kid to turn up to a high school entrance exam looking like a hobo. No offense to Eraserhead, but adults can get away with that a lot easier than a kid can. Especially when they're an underground pro hero and it helps their anonymity. He needed new clothes anyway, but he wants to keep these ones as nice as possible for as long as he can because it'll be a while before he can afford something else. The t-shirt that says long-sleeve shirt across the chest and the pair of dark shorts are too big, but thankfully the shirt isn't big enough to cause suspicion, easily mistaken for a fashion choice, and it's long enough to cover how tight he has to cinch the drawstring on the shorts just so they'll stay up. He needed something he can grow into for the next few years, so he didn't really have a choice but to get a bigger size. And if he takes a moment to rehearse the lie about hand-me-downs in his head a few more times, that's his business. His cheeks flushed hot, heart hammering as he got dressed at just the thought of potentially reverting back into a person when he runs out of energy instead of a smaller animal. He's never been more thankful for this part of his quirk. Without it, not only would he have been naked in the middle of the exam arena in front of dozens of people, including President Mike, and whoever else was in that control tower, but he wouldn't have been able to explain the fact that he can still count his ribs even after a full meal while flexing, which would lead to an inquiry about his home life, which would get Fukidashi involved, and he would be so totally screwed in so many different ways it makes his head hurt, and eyes sting with stress tears just thinking about it. He's been bolder the last week, taking risks to get more food than normal, than was safe to get, in preparation for the exam, but some of it had gone bad and he threw up a few times. It had given him horrible stomach cramps, so some of it was wasted. But even if he had kept it all down and gained 5 pounds, it wouldn't have been enough to make a difference to the naked eye. He's bony. His ribs, hips, and shoulders visibly jut out in sharp lines, and he's just glad the sleeves on this shirt are long enough to cover his upper arms and hide how knobby his elbows actually are, because it would be a dead giveaway, even if it's common for teenagers to be lanky. He's always been short and big-boned even if he was thin, so his forearms and wrists don't look that out of place. He just looks like a skinny kid. So long as no one looks too closely or gets their hands around him, he's fine. And as far as he can tell, no one has even looked twice until just now. Recovery Girl probably would have asked him more personal and harder to dodge questions if she was suspicious. She's a hero after all. It's kind of their job to stick their nose into people's business when they think they might need help. Especially a kid. That comment about being human, though, maybe she's suspicious that he isn't originally human, but there's no rules in UA that say an animal with a quirk can't apply. It would be super hypocritical if there was, given that the principal is an animal with a quirk, a very famous one that has single-handedly gotten so many laws overturned, reformed, and passed to protect and empower individuals like himself. Anyways, for all that concerns him right now, he's most worried about his scores for the exams. He doesn't have access to a computer and can't afford a phone, so he has no idea what the criteria for passing was, aside from what they'd been told at the beginning of the exams and on the application forms, which he had to beg a print shop owner to print out for him in exchange for 3 days of free, and illegal, manual labor in the back of the shop as they got their paper deliveries. The man isn't nice and has no sympathy, but he's greedy and can be traded with. The trade is never fair by any right, but Izuku doesn't have the right or leverage to complain. Especially when he's the one asking for favors. His arms never hurt so much for 2 pieces of paper before, but he doesn't regret it. He'd do it again in a heartbeat, move even more boxes full of heavy parchment for twice as long, if that's what it would take to get a chance at attending UA. He got his chance. Now, he just hopes he hasn't blown it. Even if he manages to pass both the written and physical portions of the exam, it won't matter if he doesn't get that scholarship for impoverished households that will cover his tuition and school lunch. He won't be able to attend UA, the top hero school in the country, on his savings, which he currently has none of. Unless you count the 2 500-yen coins in his pocket that he picked up off the street on his way here. Izuku's thoughts and anxieties continued to swirl until he was given warm food. He did his absolute best not to scarf it while they tried his mom again, but after it failed, he made up an excuse that she had a deadline and probably turned off her phone to concentrate. Saying he's all good now and that he'll just head home sounded like a pathetic excuse even to his own ears. Recovery Girl didn't seem too pleased with it, but he's not 5 and they legally can't keep him here without cause, and the only cause they had, him being unconscious with quirk exhaustion, is taken care of. So as reluctant as they may be, without proof of something wrong, they have to let him go and he knows it, though he does feel bad for taking advantage of that fact. He thanked the staff, maybe a little more profusely than necessary, and headed out, careful about his route just in case. Heroes are nosy by nature and by training, so he won't take any chances. Before he got to a safe alley and changed, putting his clothes inside the clean trash bag and stuffed it between the buildings where it'll be safe and dry and kept in decent condition in a spot where he can get to it when he needs to without going all the way back to the beach. As soon as he got to the cat house, Izuku sprawled on the ground, staring up at the ceiling. He's absolutely exhausted. What a day. His muscles and joints are noodle limp and tired, with a promise of aching for the rest of the week. He's pretty sure that even his bones got jostled around and pushed to their limit, but he's exhausted and his stomach is a little upset from the food and nerves still, but not eating it all didn't even cross his mind. Stomach aches are way better than hunger pains. If he hadn't slept in the nurse's office for a few hours, he may have been too tired or sick to walk home. A wide smile split his face without permission. He saw so many heroes up close. He even got to meet Recovery Girl. This day could only have gone better if he had gotten autographs and tracked enough of his points in the practical to feel safe about his chances of being accepted. As it stands, he fell asleep on the floor of the cat house long before most of the Clouder found their way back and was dead to the world for almost 20 hours. Izuku waited on the side of Fukudashi's house all day every day for the whole week, risking sneaking in and out of the house for food more than he ever has and getting increasingly nervous every day as he watched and listened to the man wonder where things had disappeared to, becoming angrier and angrier that he could have sworn he bought something and hadn't eaten it. Thankfully, he was usually too drunk to remember if he had, and occasionally leaving some crumbs on plates and wrappers around him, or his armchair made the man think he had eaten it while drunk and just didn't remember. He burst into Izuku's room a few times to blame him, but Izuku made sure he was never in the house while the man was awake, and he rarely went in when he was even home, preferring to wait until Fukudashi left if he could. He staked out the mailbox every day from around the time the mail was supposed to show up to when he was positive it wasn't there, giving up a whole hour, sometimes two, every day of trying to find his next meal. Though his newest transformation of rabbit was helpful with that. There wasn't a lot of grass and vegetation to munch on near the edges of the fence per se, but chewing on and hiding as a green rabbit in those pockets of overgrown green grass under the shade of bushes while enjoying a vision range of almost 360 was a lot more useful and safer than just hanging out as a dirty cat or a small bird in a half-dead bush. Most of the time. Occasionally when he was bored or brave enough he became a crow and chilled on the roof or in the trees to watch. He's never been more grateful for his genes. His camouflage was near perfect. Enough that it took the edge off of waiting in possibly the most dangerous area to him. Birds are less noticeable than cats, but they make him way more nervous because of the incident with his first time as a bird that he would rather not relive. He spent half his time watching the sky instead of doing whatever he set out to do, so he didn't spend long amounts of time in that form. The rabbit is quickly becoming one of his favorites, if only for the sheer ability to literally just eat grass and be damn near invisible to people among the foliage. If he wasn't so small, he might risk trying this transformation at the cat house to test run the Clouder's reactions, but the last few weeks have been stressful enough, he'll save that experiment for later. When he can afford it. Most days he was disappointed after the mail carrier came and went, and he quickly checked the box for a letter for him as stealthily as he could. He knew Fukudashi was usually out at this time and wouldn't be home until well after dark, but it was close to the end of the month, which means any day now he would get a check from social services for taking care of Izuku, which means he'd be around to collect the mail until he got the check. He was so nervous that Fukudashi would get his letter from UA before he could that his head felt like it was made of helium and his stomach turned like a rock polisher the entire time he waited. Even the grass didn't help much after a certain point. That or it could just be that skipping meals is more dangerous for him than a normal person because of the energy requirements for his quirk. Especially because he's been changing back and forth between cat, bird, rabbit, and human every day for a whole week on top of skipping a more substantial meal than lawn clippings just to get first pick at the mail. Granted, it's not his best plan ever, but he doesn't really have another. Finally, Lady Luck took pity on him and rewarded his due diligence. Izuku perked up as the mail carrier came, setting a crisp white letter with a circle of red in the box, and as soon as the person was moving down the street, Izuku, a boy for once, jumped up from his hidden place at the side of the house and ran for the box, trying his best to not look too eager. He snatched the letter, and his heart pounded at the UA symbol pressed into the old-fashioned wax seal. He stuffed the rest of the mail back into the box before taking off down the street like a penguin with its ass on fire. Without looking too suspicious, of course. Pretty sure he failed that part. He got 2 blocks away before he ducked into an alley and risked transforming into a dog just so he can run faster through dark, stinky alleyways that always smell so much worse to a canine nose. He held the package and his old thin clothes securely in his mouth, a little saliva getting on them, but that doesn't matter. He's just going to rip the package open anyway, and as long as he can still read the contents, it won't be a problem. This is kinda hard for a letter though. Maybe they put it in a case or something to protect it? It's a bit small for that. It feels more like a disc. Oh no. If it's a video on a disc, who uses those anymore? Then again, wax seal, or a USB, he'll need a computer to see it. As soon as he got back to the beach, he transformed back to a person. He threw his clothes on in a rush, and ran to the cat house. He barely crawled inside before tearing at the package with his stubby fingers. His cat claws would have been more effective than stubby grimy nails, but he doesn't want to tear anything important by accident. He's too nervous to laugh at how the cats, the ones that were awake, immediately chased the paper scraps as he tore and flung them around the room like confetti. His worry morphed into confusion as a metal disc about the size of his palm with a blackish marble in the center tumbled out. It looks more like a cross between a Roomba, a drink coaster, and a frisbee than any sort of technology he's familiar with. It was quiet while he and the cat stared at it in confusion. Frosting let out a trilling little meow, curiously sniffing at the disc, as if asking Izuku what the hell he brought home for dinner. Izuku finally reached out, but before he could touch it, the giant, bulbous orange tabby that he affectionately named Cobbler, pounced on the tiny blinking white light on the top. Izuku jumped, flailing as he fell on his backside, cats scattering like fireworks as a projection of all might, sprouted from the top of the device to the wall, the image distorted by the shapes of boxes. He scrambled to grab the device and in a last-ditch effort, aimed it at the ceiling as the flattest surface he could think of. Izuku, flat on his back, couldn't do anything but stare with his heart pounding in his throat as the message played. He didn't move a muscle aside from his breathing becoming more and more shallow and his chest starting to ache and burn from tensing, right up to the end of the video and the disappearance of the recording. He numbly sat up, pulling his knees up to his chest and wrapping his arms around himself. His eyes stung and tears slid down his cheeks before he was sobbing into the bony knobs loud enough to startle the cats that had ventured back inside, his shoulders shaking as worried cats wound around him on all sides, meowing, purring and brushing up against him, some batting at the device like it had personally offended them. He couldn't believe it. All that work. He sobbed as Colby brute forced his way into Izuku's lap, almost pushing him back over. Izuku wrapped his arms around the fluffy beast and squeezed as he wailed loudly into the darkness. I did it! I got a scholarship for Yui! Izuku fiddled with the red necktie around his throat that he clumsily tied this morning using a dirty reflection in partially rusted scrap metal. He's never tied a tie before, but he's seen lots of gangsters in these parts do it, and after watching from way too close for safety a few times, he remembers the basic steps. That being said, it's harder than it looks. He had to redo it no less than 20 times before it was even passable as a tie. As is, it's barely long enough to occupy the space on his chest where it's supposed to, but it's nowhere near long enough to tuck into his blazer like it should be. He can only hope he doesn't get in trouble for it. His uniform already looks too big for him, even though the sizing is technically correct for the measurements he sent in. He had to guess for some of those based on how short his current clothes are, but he thinks he may have guessed wrong on a few things. Hopefully, it's not enough to be noticeable. Hopefully. The shirt almost reaches his thighs and the pants would be too long to walk if it wasn't for his chunky, beat-up red sneakers catching the extra fabric around his ankles so he won't trip. But other than those, everything else either fits well enough or is hidden by the blazer. He smoothed down the blazer again, glancing to make sure there were no wrinkles or stains left by his clammy hands. He doesn't think he'll get in trouble, but he can't help gnawing his lip to hell as he walked to school with the yellow backpack he's had since he was 9. The last birthday present he ever got. Dress code violations aren't something he can get expelled for, right? It's only middle schools that give you a certain number of warnings for that before they kick you out or suspend you. Right. He read the student handbook they sent with his acceptance letter. That went unnoticed until he stopped crying and actually realized the package wasn't empty, cover to cover over a dozen times. But it didn't say anything about what happens after you get 3 dress code violations, just that you only get 3. The specifications on what's a violation were a bit vague too. There were about 3 total clear points that sum up to: wear your school blazer, shirt, and pants. Everything after that was inclusive, especially for mutations and sizing, which is always nice to see, but confusing, and he's not sure if it was just him jumbling things up to be more complicated than they wouldn't be the first time and won't be the last, or if it was done on purpose, 'cause it is UA, or if it was an honest mistake and actually is confusing. It didn't say clearly that he was required to. It seemed like they only really cared about the blazer and pants. Probably so students are identifiable, that is the point of uniforms after all. So maybe they really just don't care about anything but that. That would make sense. UA is famous for, well, what amounts to basically freestyle education. They boast about it. So it's probably fine. But they wouldn't have sent the tie if he wasn't supposed to wear it, right? Izuku fidgeted with the red material again before shaking his hands out and took a breath, blowing it out of his mouth in a way that puffed up his cheeks. He ran an absent hand through his hair, snagging stubby fingers on coarse, tangled curls. No matter how many times he tried to untangle them, it never seemed to last. He cleaned up as best he could this morning. He didn't want to smell, but he's afraid he's just gone from smelling like dirt, sweat, and cats, to smelling so strongly of the ocean that he might as well have stuffed seaweed and a fish or 2 in his pockets. He hopes his hair at least doesn't look too unruly. Considering the crude washing he gave it with the rarely used pet shampoo, reserved for when one of the cats has rolled in something particularly pungent or sticky, and no amount of grooming, self or otherwise, would handle it, he's not confident that it doesn't. If he had access to clippers or even a razor or something, he could just shave it off, but that might make him stick out even more, and he's not sure how that will affect his fur. For some reason, the idea of cutting his hair any shorter is oddly unsettling, like it would make him vulnerable. His thoughts continued to circle and spiral up and down, and he was a giant knot of nerves as he walked to school, fidgeting with his tie every 2 minutes, wringing his hands, ignoring the emptiness of his stomach after only having a week-old crumbled granola bar for breakfast. He had saved something for his first day of school, but when you live with 6 or more stray cats and no locks, nothing is truly safe, no matter what you do to protect it, and Hunter has a particularly annoying skill for getting to food he's not supposed to eat, including snatching it out of Izuku's hand halfway to his mouth, and tearing off down the beach with no remorse. Izuku let out a gargantuan sigh, hooking his hands around his backpack straps, just to have something to squeeze. He should just be thankful none of the Clouder were interested in the granola bar and graciously left it behind for him. Izuku was too preoccupied trying not to shrivel about how mortifying it'll be later when his stomach will no doubt decide to play a symphony during class at the quietest possible moment, and not used to having his eyes this far away from his feet to see the rock in his path before his stomach lurched with the unmistakable sensation of gravity getting revenge on those who defy it. His hand shot out in front of him to catch himself, the ground coming up too quickly not to panic before a hard slap hit his back square between the shoulder blades, leaving a slight sting, and an even stranger feeling of feather-light weightlessness wrapped him in an instant, almost like he'd fallen into water without the density of liquid surrounding him. And oddly enough, the sensation is familiar. Phew, that was a close one. We really should stop meeting like this. Izuku turned his head and briefly squinted against the sunlight, ignoring how his stomach sloshed in the worst way possible as a familiar head of brown hair came into focus. It's you! Izuku blinked dumbly. The girl shot a smile at him and pulled him upright to a standing position before pressing all 10 of her fingers together and muttering a quick release. Izuku's weight abruptly returned to him, and his face burned as he almost fell again even though his feet had only been a few centimeters off the ground. The girl's hand shot out to steady him again, but seemed to think better of touching him at the last moment. Thankfully he was able to catch himself on his own this time with only a slight stumble. I was hoping to see again actually. I never got your name. I'm Ochako Uraraka. The bright, bubbly brunette introduced herself. It reminds him of a fizzy pink soda. Me Midoriya Izuku. Izuku felt the burn in his cheeks, embarrassment scorching like hot tea through his face as he stuttered through his first proper introduction with someone his own age and literal years. "Nice to meet you, Midoriya. I'm glad I ran into you. I never got a chance to say thank you for saving me in the exam. What class are you in?" Izuku blinked, flustered with how fast this conversation is moving, or maybe it's moving at a normal pace and he just isn't used to it. It's been a while since he's talked to people, especially people his own age, and now he's taking too long to answer. Wanna. He didn't mean for it to sound like a question, but before he could panic, Uraraka beamed, her already cheerful smile gaining 10 times the enthusiasm. "Me too. We're in the same class, that's awesome. I'm glad to have someone I know in there. I was kinda nervous, not knowing anybody, first aid jitters, you know?" She smiled sheepishly, her shoulders relaxing as relief and excitement bled the tension out of them. Izuku can't blame her. A similar sense of relief soothed the gnarled pit of anxiety that's replaced his churning stomach since the day before yesterday at finding out he won't be walking into a class full of complete strangers. Now there'll be at least one person he's semi-familiar with. "Let's walk together. It'll be way less scary if we go in together, don't you think?" Uraraka offered, and with all of his social graces Izuku floundered to spit out a hasty "Sure," as he stumbled to move with her. He's glad Uraraka seems to know the way to class because he was too nervous to remember the map he tried to memorize the night before. Clearly, his memorization techniques can use a little work. Among other things. As they reached the door, Izuku vaguely noted that it's bigger than he thought it would be, almost comically so if size quirks and giant mutations weren't so common. He took a deep breath trying to steady his nerves, Uraraka doing the same with a little more success, before the much braver girl steeled herself and pushed it open. Izuku expected and worried about a lot of things for his first day of school. Stepping into class and doing a double-take at a spiky-haired blonde sitting in the front row on the far side of the classroom was the last thing that would have crossed his mind. Even though it probably should have been one of the first, after all, he's only known that the boy was going to UA for their entire lives, since the day they found out it's where All Might went to school. Izuku's mouth dropped open so fast his jaw clicked and the familiar childhood nickname tumbled out before he could think better of it. "Kaken?" The blonde's head snapped over with a familiar sharp glare on his face, and red eyes fixed on him and widened a fraction, the most outright expression of confusion Izuku's seen on him since they were 6. "Deku? What the fuck are you doing here?" Bakugo Katsuki. Izuku's childhood best friend, who he hasn't seen since they were 10, before he went into the foster system. Someone he hasn't seen since before his mother was alive. The weight of seeing each other here seemed to settle into both of them as soon as that thought registered in Izuku's mind. Kaken's eyes glanced down, seeming to only just now notice the UA uniform wrapping Izuku. "Why the fuck are you?" The bell interrupted the blonde and 2 familiar smells hit Izuku's nose at the same time, one of burning caramel and the other of cat treats. "Go somewhere else if you want to play at being friends." Izuku almost choked on a startled yelp, and jumped half a foot in the air when a deep and dull voice muttered right behind him. If sleep had a voice, it would sound like that. Izuku whirled around as a yellow sleeping bag rose up, towering over him, and then he really choked. He spluttered before he could think better of it. "Eraserhead!" Dark eyes fixed on him with the slightest furrow of the man's eyebrows. The action would look neutral, or even disinterested to anyone who doesn't know him, but Izuku very much does know him, and that face practically screams. "I don't know how the hell you knew that. It's borderline suspicious." Izuku almost didn't recognize the hero at first. Somehow he looks even more exhausted than Izuku's used to, but there's no mistaking him, and even if Izuku wasn't looking right into the man's face, when his nose is filled with the familiar mix of smells of coffee, gelatin, something distinctly sleepy, and his favorite cat treats, it would be hard to mistake the hero for someone else. Much to his relief, Mr. Eraserhead seemingly decided not to comment on his knowing the hero's name. It's rare for unders to be recognized, but not unheard of. With any luck, since when does Izuku have any of that? Mr. Eraserhead won't think too deeply about it. Dark eyes watched him for a moment before the man slurped the rest of a jelly pouch and shoved it in his pocket. It took 12 seconds before you were quiet. The class watched, baffled, as Eraserhead shed his sleeping bag like a second skin. Though for most of them it was a question about who this man is and not why the hell a pro-hero known for stealth and a man who hates attention from anything but dirty street cats is crawling around a high school in a bright yellow sleeping bag. Maybe Mr. Eraserhead is colorblind and doesn't know it's a red and a burning bright color? Then again, his goggles are almost the same shade. Maybe he just likes yellow? Time is limited. You kids aren't rational enough. Izuku tried not to grimace or show too much concern on his face. He's not supposed to know Eraserhead, but that's hard when somehow the hero looks even more worn out outside of the sleeping bag. I'm your homeroom teacher, Aizawa Shoyuta. What? Izuku's eyes almost bugged out of his head like a cartoon character. Mr. Eraserhead is his homeroom teacher. He didn't even know he taught at UA. A weird sense of betrayal zipped through him before it was squashed by the giant hammer of rationality in his brain. Why and what person would tell a stray cat on the other end of the city what their day job was? The man's dry, flat voice is devoid of the subtle warmth Izuku's gotten used to. It's weirdly off-putting, and he tried not to flinch or curl his shoulders at the indifferent, tired tone. For a split second he even thought he'd done something wrong or made the hero mad, but it was gone before it could get caught in his anxiety jacuzzi. Mr. Eraser, Aizawa-sensei reached into that yellow sleeping bag and pulled out a recognizable dark blue shirt with white and red accents. Clothes he's seen broadcast across Japan for UA's sports festival almost every year since he was old enough to watch it. It's sudden, but put these on and go out onto the field. Without a beat of pause, Mr. Eraserhead walked out. After a beat of silence, Izuku was one of 4 students, including Bakugo, who moved simultaneously, having taken the orders much quicker than those who followed a step later, and soon the entire class had an armful of gym clothes and was headed out. Izuku's not sure how they knew where the locker room was, and it feels like he may have missed something in his packet, but he knows for sure there wasn't a school map like his middle school had. Is that a high school thing or a UA thing? UA is so secretive about things like this, it's probably a UA thing. Despite being one of the first to move and being one of the 3 closest to the door, he wound up in the middle of the pack with others who grabbed their uniform and found himself near the back as they traveled down the hall, simply following whoever was in front, and seemed to know where they were going. Izuku lagged a bit on purpose, feeling a little dizzy with how hard he's racking his brain about how to change in a locker room full of people who will definitely notice something odd about him, whether that's the lack of meat on his bones or his state of hygiene, and are far more likely to ask questions than any of his previous classmates. Can he just go to the bathroom? The locker room is usually next to the bathroom, right? But UA is so different, what if that's different too? Sorry, what did you say? You need the bathroom? I think there's one inside the locker room. He jumped as a boy with spiky bright red hair stretched a sharp-toothed but friendly smile at him, pointing in front of them where the majority of their class was turning into an opening, the few girls breaking off to go into the one right next to it. Above the door was the expected first-year locker room sign with a bathroom symbol beside it. Oh, thanks. He smiled sheepishly, the apples of his cheeks burning a little as he unconsciously rubbed the back of his neck. A sliver of disgust curled his stomach at the tacky, gritty sensation of his hairline under the pads of his fingers. He didn't get all the strands on his neck, they're still stiff and oily. He needs to cut it too. No problem, bro. I'm Kirishima Idra, by the way. What's your name? Oh, me Midoriya Izuku. Nice to meet you, bro. It's super exciting to finally be here at UA, isn't it? I was so hyped last night I couldn't sleep. Why yeah, me too. Is this continuing? Did he just accidentally start a conversation? Looks like the bathroom's over there. See you on the field. Kirishima pointed and waved as he followed his desk number to the corresponding locker just like the rest of the class, and Izuku breathed a sigh of relief. That went well, right? Kirishima is really nice. The relief of a successful conversation couldn't compare to what he felt as he was able to go straight to the bathrooms and nobody really noticed him, so he didn't get any strange looks going into the bathroom with his clothes instead of to the lockers. He changed quickly, struggling with the necktie as he somehow tied his fingers into the knot instead of undoing it. Twice. But he got there in the end, and his thoughts whirled at breakneck speed about what they're doing. Middle school was nothing like this. Maybe at UA they do PE as the first class? They haven't gotten their class schedules yet, so he doesn't know. It would make sense for at least the hero course though, it is a hero school after all. He resisted the urge to stick his head under the sink faucet as he exited and peeked into the vacated locker room to find his locker and toss his other uniform into it. It would definitely draw attention if he showed up on the field with wet hair. He caught up with the tail end of the class, mostly the girls and the last few boys heading out, and stood next to the rest of his classmates. It's strangely anxiety-inducing. Especially since Kaken is standing on the other end of the student lineup, but is still eyeing him like Izuku put a stink bug in his lunch box. The teacher's eyes scanned over the class before nodding now that everyone was present. We'll start with physical and quirk assessment tests today. A quirk assessment test. The whole class besides Izuku and maybe 3 others shouted in unison. A quirk assessment? Izuku quickly squashed the reflexive fear that shot down his spine. He has a quirk now. He has a quirk. It's his, it's real, they've seen it, Yui has seen it. That's why he got accepted. There's no reason for him to be singled out or left behind anymore. What about the entrance ceremony? And orientation? Uraraka asked, though she didn't really sound opposed to not going to those. Izuku, on the other hand, maybe would have liked to learn about the school because apparently he's the only one who doesn't know where anything is here and he can already tell that he's going to get lost a lot and or be following his classmates to get where they need to be. If you're going to become a hero, you don't have time for such leisurely events. Aizawa droned. He glanced around the class and the rising anxiety calmed a smidge. He's glad he isn't the only one who looks nervous or confused. He thought he'd missed something important. Again. He thought he was observant before, but he's really rethinking that now. Though confused, his classmates buzzed with far more excitement a moment later as they collectively realized they're going to get to use their quirks on the first day of school, for their first class. Yui sure is different. This will be his first real quirk assessment. He stopped cold. This is his first quirk assessment. Ever. His throat muscles ground together as he swallowed hard, pushing down the lump of bile that tried to rise before it could clamber its way up. UA's selling point is how unrestricted its school traditions are. Aizawa glanced over his shoulder. That's also how the teachers run their classes. You kids have been doing these since junior high too, right? He took out his phone, showing the screen to the class. Physical fitness tests where you weren't allowed to use your quirks. It was a rhetorical question, but Izuku very nearly squeaked out a no, and maybe he would have if literally anyone else had. He's never done a quirk assessment as part of the class before. He was always excluded from anything that had to do with quirks at school. Quirk counseling? No quirk to counsel. Quirk assessment? Error 404, quirk not found. The country still uses averages taken from results from students not using their quirks. It's not rational. Well, the Ministry of Education is procrastinating. Izuku has a vague recollection of Mr. Eraserhead grumbling about something like a few weeks ago, but he brought Izuku chicken pieces, and it was a bad day for hunting, so he missed a good portion of the conversation. Bakugo, you were the top scorer for the practical exam, right? Kaken shifted at being addressed out of the blue and gave an affirming hum. In junior high, what was your best result for the softball throw? 67 meters. Kaken answered without even having to think about it. 67. It was 58 the last time Izuku saw him. It's just like him to remember his best scores perfectly, but his mellowed-out attitude is tripping Izuku up. Then, try doing it with your quirk. Aizawa-sensei lazily tossed the softball he pulled out of nowhere, and Kaken caught it without missing a beat, and confidently, although a bit confused, moved to the white circle on the ground that Aizawa-sensei pointed to. Aizawa-sensei lazily shoved his hands back into his pockets. You can do whatever you want as long as you stay in the circle. Hurry up. Give it all you've got. Kaken reeled the ball back with proper pitching form and with a ringing shout of die. The smell of burning caramel flooded Izuku's nose, the explosion ripping from Kaken's hand and launching the smoldering ball like a cannonball. Izuku wasn't the only one who jumped, even though he knew it was coming, but he did jump less than Uraraka and Kirishima standing on either side of him. Know your own maximum first. Aizawa-sensei's phone gave a muted bleep and he turned around, showing the glowing blue numbers to the class. That is the most rational way to form the foundation of a hero. Izuku's eyebrows flew off his forehead, disappearing into his hairline never to be seen again. 705 meters. The entire class reeled with a chorus of startled and disbelieving exclamations. 705 meters? Seriously? A boy just behind Izuku's left shoulder with yellow hair asked with nervous incredulity. This looks like fun! A near-giddy girl with pink skin and hair and tan horns rocked on her toes in excitement. Kaken is as impressive as always. Some things never change, and that's strangely comforting. That's insane! We can use our quirks as much as we want. As expected of the hero course. Another boy on the other side of Kirishima with black hair that's somehow spiky at the bottom evidently finds it much cooler. The entire class is getting fired up, but Izuku felt a sudden shiver down his spine and alarm somewhere inside him tripping that made him freeze and slowly look to Mr. Eraser, Aizawa-sensei. The same one he's been getting used to since adjusting to being a rabbit that screams don't move a muscle and locks up when he's at risk of being spotted. It looks fun. Huh! Izuku struggled to resist the urge to shrink down and hide in the high collar of his uniform. Aizawa-sensei looked at them flatly. You have 3 years to become a hero. Will you have an attitude like that the whole time? All right. Thin lips pulled up into a grin just barely on the side of sadistic, and a shiver of alarm raced down Izuku's spine. It would actually be less scary if the man narrowed his eyes and outright scowled at them. Whoever comes in last place in all 8 tests. He doesn't like this. Will be judged to have no potential, and the punishment will be. Izuku's shoulders attached themselves to his earlobes. Expulsion. Izuku felt like he swallowed a boiled stone. Equals caret caret equals. The test started off on a strong foot. His skin raced with the transformation, and he ignored the soft gasps like he sometimes hears from passers-by from his classmates' direction, and flapped his wings. What better for an obstacle course than a bird that can dive right through and ignore most of it? With a solid beat of dark green feathers, the crow took off with a grace that Izuku the human could only dream of having. He soared over and through obstacles and objects faster than even the boy with the speed quirk. His confidence grew as his choice proved to be the right one. The smaller aerodynamic form was completely unimpeded by the test meant to mimic the parkour jungle of modern society. Even as one of his lesser-used forms, of which he doesn't have even a tenth of the skill he enjoys as a cat, he can still move through the course with more ease than he expected, and before he knew it, he soared over the line and took first place without apology for the first time in his life. He won. He didn't just participate in the assessment, or second-guess himself into a lower score, he actually won. Izuku nearly cheered out loud, but all that came out was a strong caw. I even beat Kaken. His brain screeched to a grinding halt. He beat Kaken. He beat Kaken. Izuku chanced a glance at He Blonde and immediately looked away from the confused fury. His childhood friend isn't coming towards him, but Izuku suspects the only thing saving him from a confrontation right here and now is that Kaken has always taken class work very seriously and would never do anything to jeopardize his own performance. But as soon as there is no assignment to be doing, he's screwed. Kaken won't let him go until he has answers to the questions Izuku can see burning on the blonde's tongue, probably behind a layer of curses that would make a sailor blush. If he had any idea what those questions were, he would answer them immediately. It's not like he lost contact with Kaken on purpose. But he looks pissed, even more so than before, and Izuku doesn't know why. Aside from knowing Kaken doesn't like to lose. The last time they saw each other they had finally repaired their friendship after all those years of misunderstanding, but that was before foster care and before he switched schools. Any number of things could have happened since then, and for all he knows, Kaken is upset about not staying in contact, and he'd have every reason to be. It upset Izuku for a long time at first. Barely a day went by when he didn't wish his best friend was there, even just to talk to him, and after that, he didn't have the luxury of caring. He didn't have access to a phone that didn't cost money, even if he still remembers the Bakugo's phone numbers. Izuku jolted when his name was called for the next test, and did his best to put everything else out of his mind and focus, succeeding only with the practice of a skilled hunter whose next meal is never certain. He didn't bother shifting back to human for the entire duration of the tests, going from one animal to the next. It's much more comfortable to be an animal, but this way he didn't have to fuss about changing back into his gym uniform, and it helped his anxiety to not have it written all over his face and body language for everyone to see. And most of his animals can't blush, so whenever a Natsuroku or "Oh, that's so cool!" caught his ears, he could pretend he didn't hear it. He's never gone through this many transformations before, and the longer the tests went, the more time he spent between them just trying to sit and breathe. It didn't occur to him until halfway through that maybe he wasn't supposed to be using his quirk between the tests. But he glanced at Aizawa-sensei, and the hero didn't look like he cared, so Izuku talked himself into relaxing. He doesn't know if the man has different rules he behaves by as a teacher, but Mr. Eraserhead isn't the kind of person who cares about following rules to the letter. In fact, Izuku knows he breaks rules on purpose sometimes. He's seen the hero let people off with warnings when he technically isn't supposed to. From everything he's gathered through what he knows of the man, which isn't much to be honest, and from these tests, Aizawa-sensei doesn't care about the specifics, only that you accomplish the goal without breaking the specified rules. Izuku can work with that. And even better, he's seen his classmates do things that could be considered bending the rules, either by accident or on purpose, and dare he say Aizawa-sensei's eyes even looked pleased, his mouth hidden in his scarf. Izuku continued to try to gauge his teacher separate from what he knows of the hero already, and tried not to make it obvious that he was observing the man, but he quickly looked away and pretended to be busy every time sensei turned his head. By the time it came to the final test, he wiggled back into his clothes, exhausted, and feeling a little raw and exposed. He gnawed his lip in thought as he watched his classmates, and waited for his turn. His scores thus far have been good, but not as good as he'd like. He's fairly certain that he's safe from expulsion, which is a huge relief, but it's not enough. He doesn't want to stop at enough, he wants to do his best at everything so he knows what to work on. He has over a decade less practice with his quirk than his classmates and peers. Doing decent on these tests has already been a miracle, and it's entirely because he's been careful with his choice of animals. Izuku went to the circle as his name was called, taking the ball from the robot with an automatic "Thank you," only noticing he thanked the robot when it nodded back. His face heated all the way to his ears, stomach squirming in embarrassment, and he firmly shoved that interaction into a box to think about later. Probably when he's trying to sleep. He doesn't have a lot of energy left to work with now, so what's the best animal for throwing the ball? Which one can throw the hardest? What about the farthest? His first thought is the lemur because it has opposable thumbs that can actually pick up the ball, and it's small so its energy cost is low, but a lemur can't throw that far, definitely less than a human. But this is the last test. Even if it costs him the rest of his energy, and he has to be a hedgehog for the rest of the school day, he wants to do his best, so he shouldn't limit his choices based on energy cost. If he switches fast, he should be able to do a large transformation for long enough to throw the ball, and can wait for the score as something smaller. So he should prepare for a rapid switch before he even starts. Nodding to himself, he started to think seriously about all of his options. An elephant's trunk is by far the strongest thing he's got for this skill, it's the strongest he's got, period. But he doesn't know if he can even hold a transformation that size without preparing like he did for the entrance exam beforehand. He didn't think to do that for the first day of school. He didn't know they were going to start using their quirks right away either. Is it even a good idea to use his quirk for this test? It was useful in the other ones, but maybe his normal arm, skinny as it is the best option for this? After all, he can't rely on his quirk for every tea. Midoriya. Aizawa cut off the rambling he hadn't realized he'd been doing out loud, albeit mostly under his breath. Sorry, Mr. Air, Aizawa-sensei. Izuku squeaked and wound his arm back. He threw the ball as hard as he could manage, even though he knows his arm's strength is nowhere near the best. As it left his fingers, he had a panicked thought that he could have thrown it farther if he turned into a bird or something and gotten higher first, but he quickly dismissed the idea because he wouldn't be able to carry a baseball, which are surprisingly heavy, with any bird he has. Even if he had a bird big enough to carry it, he would need to ascend in a circular motion in order to get high enough and stay within the circle, which means this circle would need to be wider in the first place. It might not be possible unless he did 2 quick transformations. One to get higher, like the kangaroo, and then become a bird, but it would be hard to keep track of if he was still in the circle from that height too. Izuku's 100-mile-an-hour thoughts continued as he moved back to stand by his classmates. His score wasn't noteworthy, a bit below average truthfully, but honestly? He's proud of himself anyway. With his noodle arms, he's never been very strong, but he was expecting it to be a pathetic throw, and instead it was halfway decent. Not enough to be singled out on either end of the scale, and that alone is enough to take his anxiety down a peg. That and exhaustion. He feels a little bit sick, actually. He got some great ideas from the tests though. Because the energy cost for large things is so big, rapid transformations might be the best solution, if only for efficiency. He already uses rapid transformation to scare off other strays invading his territory. Quick shifts always catch them off guard, and people are still animals, so there's no reason it shouldn't work on them too. A small thing suddenly becoming a large one has an ingrained reaction in most animals. Though no, it's big enough to eat me reaction. The problem will be testing that strategy. He can pretty much only do that in class because nobody in the universe would see that happen and not have Quirk be their first thought. Putting that aside, separating his animals by small and large in his head, and keeping one of each in mind would make rapid changing a breeze. It would be even easier to decide what animal to use by first thinking if he needs something big or small. Then he can further break it down by things like defense or offense, fight or flight, ground or sky, etc. Those decisions already come to him naturally. If he shifts his thinking just a little into a speedrun of that decision tree, he might be able to train himself to a point where he's making half the decisions subconsciously, or by muscle memory. The only drawback he can think of is he'll have to work to make sure he's not always relying on the same animals, because if he becomes predictable, the invaders will grow accustomed to it, and he won't be able to scare them off as easy. But his list of animals isn't likely to grow much further. There's only so many animals in Japan, or that he'll ever have the opportunity to touch. Not even counting how many will actually be useful. It took several more trains of thought for him to realize he'd gone from thinking about using his quirk to fight villains, to chasing off strays invading his territory. An infinity score by Uraraka brought him back to the present, and he must be tired because even he was starting to notice that he couldn't keep his train of thought on track to save his life. He was having trouble not falling down the rabbit hole on his classmates' quirks. Now that he was done dissecting his own. As long as he's not swaying and his skin doesn't prickle, he'll be fine. In the end, he didn't come in last, so he'll take it. He even placed higher than he expected, getting 9th place. And that's only because he hesitated on a few things, and his score from the ball toss definitely brought down his overall average. Izuku isn't sure about Mr. Eraser, Aizawa-sensei's expulsion threat. It's hardly fair after they all fought so hard just to get to this starting point. But when has anything ever been fair? He's not sure he's ever encountered something that was fair. It sounds more like a superstition to him. Something made up that people tell kids to make them feel better, or something intangible and hard to actually prove or disprove even if we have evidence for it, like luck. That being said, the kid who did place last gives him a weird feeling. The shortest kid in class and some kind of sticky purple balls instead of hair as his quirk. He didn't catch the boy's name, but there's just something off about him. It makes his hair stand up every time he looks at the guy, and he's not sure of the reason, but he does know why. Izuku only has this nebulous instant dislike towards things and people he should stay away from, but this is a little more than just that. He can't pinpoint the trigger of his prickly sense, but something is setting Izuku's teeth on edge when he's near the kid. No, it's not setting him on edge, he wants to bare his teeth at the boy. It's the same feeling he gets from some people when they pass him, cat him, on the streets. The ones who lurk at the back of dark alleys at questionable times, even if they aren't actually doing anything. Something that whispers watch him in the back of Izuku's mind, and he can't quite tell if it's the one that says watch his prey or watch a potential threat, and that's enough to make it impossible to ignore. It's the kind of feeling that makes him observe closely and carefully. That screams at the back of his head not to take his eyes off of them until either they're well and truly gone, to get away from them before they see him, or to pounce. And if there's one thing he never ignores, that he's not even sure is possible to ignore, it's his instincts. The kid glanced at him a few times, and though Izuku's first instinct is usually to look away when people look at him, especially if they look him in the eyes, even he himself is a little startled when he realizes he isn't doing that with that guy. He's been staring the guy down, and his throat clicks and constricts the way it does when he lets out low growls to warn off anything that's pushing its luck and invading his space. But without the right vocal construction it sounded different, it didn't sound right. Usually the encroacher complies with the warning, but sometimes it ends in a fight that Izuku inevitably wins because the fights are rare enough to warrant changing into a larger creature to scare the other animal off instead of wasting his energy and possibly getting hurt. That could be a death sentence on the street, especially if the other creature is sick, dirty, infected, carrying something, or all of the above. It's been a long time since Izuku felt this way. Since something has dared to challenge him and make his hackles raise, but here he is, raising them against another student of all things, and he has no idea why, other than this vague feeling to be vigilant. To see if the scavenger will push the boundary and get too close. It almost feels like, when he's hunting the bigger rats in the alleys. Izuku's throat subconsciously moved, relaxing and tensing different muscles on its own until something clicked, and the low vibration in the center of his throat startled him into a cough. What was that? That's never happened before. He missed the startled and vaguely alarmed looks from the guy, the tall polite girl next to him, and 3 other classmates with better hearing, though the other 2 were more curious about the sound than nervous. Eraserhead's dull voice brought him back to the present, and Izuku belatedly realized they'd been told to hit the showers and head to lunch. Unfortunately, expulsion was a logical ruse, and while Izuku is relieved that no one who fought to get here will be having all their hard work slapped across the face and kicked to the curb on the first day, some part of him is angry that the purple boy is still here, still nearby, still within his territory. Izuku's eyebrows furrowed as he trailed after the other students, confused by his own feelings. He has in no way, shape, or form been here long enough to think of UA as his territory. And it wouldn't even be his if he had. Why does he feel so hostile towards that kid? He didn't do anything to warrant such a response from Izuku. Did he? No. He barely knows the guy, scratch that, he doesn't know that kid, they're complete strangers. Izuku can't even remember his name. But still, he doesn't like him. And he's determined to find out why, because he hasn't reacted that way to any of his other classmates. So far. He resisted the urge to groan. He hopes this isn't gonna be a thing that he has to learn to live with. For all he knows, this is normal for him, he just hasn't been around anyone else or sharing his space with other people since his quirk manifested, and the purple kid has just been singled out as the first of many territorial threat displays to come. Gods, he hopes not. Izuku is convinced that heaven is a real place, and it's right here, in the UA locker room. He stood under the warm spray of a shiny, chrome shower head with something akin to reverence. It's been so long since he's had a warm shower. A proper one. Not a frantic high-tension scrub down, trying to break the world record and get out before Fukidashi catches him vulnerable. The ocean water and soap that he uses to wash away the smell of the dump works. But it's freezing and he can't always find a clean enough cloth to blacken for the sponge baths he has when he isn't brave enough to sneak back to the house for the world's fastest showers. He did the night before the exam and washed his hair again with pet shampoo when he woke up at the crack of dawn, but he cut it pretty close and he doesn't dare go back to Fukudashi's anytime soon. Not with how often he was hanging around while waiting for the exam results. The ocean water always makes him smell like the sea, and the salt is a bit uncomfortable in his hair, making it stiff and wiry to the touch, but at least it keeps his curls in check, and the smell is easy enough to explain away by just saying he lives on the coast. The excuse worked on his middle school classmates well enough, there's no reason it shouldn't work here. He's thankful he had that excuse prepared when Ajui commented on it after the assessment, wondering why he smelled so much like the sea when his quirk doesn't have anything to do with that. Apparently she had initially dismissed it as part of his quirk before she saw his quirk in the assessment. Izuku had blushed bright red, awkwardly rubbing the back of his head, and had stuttered an excuse. Yeah. I'll live by the sea, so the smell, it kinda gets into everything. Trailing off with an awkward chuckle that left an embarrassed heat on his face that has only just started to fade, and he's pretty sure the water is just raising his skin temperature to match it. He'll take mild embarrassment and a flash pen excuse over the mortification he surely would have suffered if he couldn't come up with anything and had just stood there mouth fluttering like a fish with no words. He made a mental note to clean up more often because apparently he's not the only one in class with a sensitive nose, and any smell of rotting garbage mixed with rust, dirt, and sweat will be extremely obvious. He's not sure how many times he can use half-thought-out excuses like, "fell into a dumpster," before they become suspicious or even just outright avoid him because he smells. He's not sure which would be worse actually. Social ostracization is something he's used to, but it still hurts. Especially because most of his classmates, at least the few he's talked to, have all been nice so far. He shook those thoughts from his head, sending a spray of water droplets flying with his curls, and let the tension bleed out of his shoulders under the hot spray, the warm steam filling his lungs like a sauna. He never wants to leave this spot. Give him long enough and he could fall asleep standing up right here, or melt into a warm gooey puddle. It's hard to believe that from now on he gets a real shower like this almost every day, with hot water and soap and everything. So long as they keep doing hero training and or PE every day, he'll only have to worry about the weekends and he can go a few days without washing up no problem. Oh. He can just not wash his hair unless he's at school. That would be fine, nobody will comment on slightly greasy hair even if they notice it, right? Plus, he has curly hair so even if it's a little bit greasy it'll be harder to notice. Izuku has never liked school before, the learning part yeah, but not actually being at school. Yui is really different. While he's at school he doesn't have to worry about things like washing up and he gets a whole meal every day here. He gets to see pro heroes every day, and he's following his dream to become a hero. He's really doing it. It's more than Izuku could have asked for, and he knows he shouldn't be greedy or get too comfortable, especially if they can be expelled at any time, but he really could get used to this. He spent an extra 5 minutes than he needed just standing under the warm stream, letting the water run down his skin and the steam boil his lungs until his head felt dizzy. When he had to brace his hand on the wall to not fall over, he finally came out of his trance and turned the water off with great reluctance. He feels a little guilty for taking longer than he needed to, but at least there's enough showers that nobody was kept waiting, he was just wasting water. He'll have to make sure not to do that next time. Next time. Izuku couldn't help the corners of his lips pulling up until he had to bite his bottom lip to keep it from getting big enough to make his cheeks hurt. A warm, almost scandalous feeling fluttered in his stomach. There's gonna be a next time. His good mood lasted only until he realized he has to change in the locker room, and the familiar panic came back from its break time. Thankfully, he's the last one out of the shower, so he just waited a little while until he couldn't hear voices inside anymore before carefully peeking in to see the room empty. He made sure everyone was gone before he slipped out of the shower area and quickly got dressed. He'll have to be careful about this from now on. The showers are on the other side of the locker room area, and there's only one way in and out of here. He was still trying to tie his tie when he left the locker room and his head, that was dipped looking at his chest, bumped straight into someone. A hand slammed against the wall beside him and Izuku flinched, just barely fighting off the instinct to bolt or attack as Kaken leaned over him. "What the fuck was that, Deku? What? Since when do you have a fucking quirk?" Izuku should have seen this coming, but honestly, he forgot that Kaken doesn't know. He got his quirk 2 years after the last time he saw him. It came in late." Izuku held his hands up in front of him placatingly, as if that would stop Katsuki from getting any closer, but old habits die hard, and as Kaken leaned forward, Izuku leaned back until his damp hair met the wall. "How long have you known about it?" Just a few years." Izuku answered in a squeak that he'll be embarrassed about later, after he stops feeling like a mouse in front of a lion. Katsuki glared at him and Izuku felt his spine prickling with the instinct to transform, but he squashed that feeling with a rare ruthlessness. He'll get in serious trouble if he uses his quirk outside of class, and this is Kaken. He doesn't need to be scared of Kaken anymore. Kaken hasn't hurt him for years. The scent of burning sugar filled his nose, and for a moment he remembered what the searing bubbles of Kaken's quirk feels like against his skin, and his breath picked up. But before he could start to panic, Kaken huffed, and the looming presence disappeared. Izuku stared at Kaken's back without moving a muscle as the angry blonde stalked away, leaving as fast as he appeared, shoving his hands in his pockets like he was trying to punch holes through the bottoms. Izuku breathed a sigh of relief he didn't know he was holding and hesitated before following the explosive blonde towards the lunchroom. He knows this conversation isn't over and he'll have to talk to Kaken properly about everything, but he's not even sure how to start that conversation, much less how Kaken will take it. So, if he lets his childhood friend get a ways ahead of him before he moves to make his own way to lunch, no one has to know. The moment he entered the hallway leading to the lunchroom, Izuku's stomach began to grumble and cramp painfully, yet his mood raised like a hot air balloon. He's been looking forward to this all day. He kept his watering mouth tightly pinched as he collected a tray and sat with Uraraka and Ida at a table with a few other classmates after they waved him over and insisted he sit with them, and he wolfed everything down like someone would take it from him. It's been so long since he had Katsudon, and he almost cried with the memories it brought of his mom in the kitchen, but food takes priority over tears. He will cry later. If he had any control over his emotions, he would have cried in the shower and gotten it out of the way. He only slowed down when he was almost finished and his stomach suddenly lurched. He paused, chopsticks just barely leaving his mouth, and even his chewing slowly came to a stop. Suddenly he's not so hungry anymore. Did he get full without realizing? That's a surreal thought. "Midoriya? Are you okay?" He looked up at Uraraka's concerned expression and nodded, putting his chopsticks down, and pulled a smile onto his face that he hoped doesn't look too tight, but judging by the concern that didn't abate, it must not be convincing. "Ha!" He gave a nervous chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. "I guess my eyes were bigger than my stomach. I ate too fast." Her face relaxed into an understanding smile, and she let out a little laugh. "I know what you mean. I knew it would be good, but I didn't expect it to be this good, and the portions are huge. It is made by Lunch Rush." Izuku agreed, ignoring how his stomach rolled and his mouth watered for a different reason as soon as he opened his mouth and exerted the effort to speak. If Uraraka or Ida noticed how he reached for his water and gulped it down to rid the taste of bile from the back of his throat, and stop the mounting efforts of the food trying to climb back up his esophagus, neither of them mentioned it. Izuku managed to make it through the rest of lunch with liberal sips of water, but as soon as he started walking back to the classroom with Uraraka and Ida, he knew he wasn't going to make it. Excuse me guys, I'm gonna use the restroom before class." The two nodded, agreeing to see each other back in class, and Izuku ducked into the bathroom that's thankfully on their path back to the classroom, so it didn't seem too suspicious, at least he hopes. Izuku barely made it into one of the dark blue stalls before his stomach heaved, and there was no chance of keeping it down this time. The taste and smell burned his nose and made his stomach roll again and again. The dry heaving was worse than the actual vomiting. It didn't stop until Izuku's knees were almost guaranteed to have bruises later from the cold hard floor. He bruises easily, and the entire contents of his previously full belly emptied into the porcelain bowl. After spitting into the bowl in a weak attempt to get the taste off his tongue, he couldn't help the inhuman disappointed and slightly pained whimper that escaped his throat as he wiped his mouth on the back of his hand, unreasonably upset about the loss of Katsudon in his stomach. That was a waste of a perfectly good meal. His first meal. He flushed it before the smell could permeate the room and make his now empty stomach turn again, mourning the loss as it swirled away down the pipes. Sure, anyone with a quirk or mutation that enhances their sense of smell will be able to tell in a heartbeat, but he's no stranger to the unpleasantries of having a better sense of smell, and public bathrooms don't smell anywhere near great in the first place, so it makes him feel better to at least try and get rid of as much of it as he can. One less odd and revolting smell for people to deal with. Though this bathroom definitely smells the best of any he smelled in a long time. The better question is, what happened? He was fine 1 minute and the next he felt like he was going to puke on the table. Thankfully, he managed not to ruin his friends' lunches, but only just his own. Well, he resisted the urge to childishly kick the bowl as he braced his hands on the seat and hauled himself to his feet. He was really looking forward to having a full stomach for the rest of the day. Izuku thought about it for a while, but ultimately dismissed it. No need to overthink this. He exercised really hard beforehand, harder than he has in months, and then scarfed a lot of heavy food like an industrial vacuum cleaner. It would be more surprising if he didn't throw up. Stupid. He'll hunt a little extra tonight and eat slower tomorrow. Equals carrot carrot equals. Lunchtime the next day and another, albeit slower, meal of katsudon had him leaning over the bowl again. Izuku flushed the toilet as he held the back of his hand over his mouth. Apparently he's just not meant to have katsudon ever again. That's twice now he's thrown up what was once his favorite food. He put a hand on his stomach. It doesn't hurt anymore, but he already knows he's going to be starving again in a few minutes, just like yesterday. He's used to this happening when he eats something bad, but he doubts something was wrong with his lunch. It's made by Lunch Rush and plenty of other students had it and looked perfectly fine. This is the second time in a row that it's happened. What are the odds of both of his lunches being off 2 days in a row but no one else's? Astronomical. He sighed. Maybe he's allergic to something? A whimper escaped his throat. He's going to have to sit through class hungry again, isn't he? He stood up, pausing at the sink to rinse out his mouth and gulp some water from the drinking fountain to pad his stomach before heading back to class. He feels woozy after throwing up. It sapped the last of his energy, but he doesn't feel bad enough to skip class and go to the infirmary. As much as he wants to just curl up and sleep, class is more important. It's only his second day. He can't be out sick on his second day. Especially when he still doesn't know whether or not Aizawa-sensei was serious about expelling students who show the least potential, and call him crazy, but he doesn't think that was a bluff. It was difficult to focus in class, but at least his stomach didn't growl like he'd been dreading. He still felt nauseous through most of it, so maybe that was to thank for the small blessing, but when the final bell rang his shoulders sagged in relief. He had no idea what he was going to do about dinner, but unlike earlier, even though he's hungry, the thought of eating something right now makes him feel queasy with nasty phantom tastes brushing the back of his tongue. He'll try having something else tomorrow that doesn't have the same ingredients used for katsudon. Maybe soba, his classmates seem to enjoy that one, or something simple like the miso soup set. Equals carrot carrot equals. That night, Izuku was rudely awoken by hunger pains in the middle of the night, and no matter how much he tried, he couldn't go back to sleep. So instead, he went prowling around to make himself feel better, trying to find a late-night snack and maybe something for breakfast tomorrow so he won't feel weak for hero class. He's having to switch when he goes looking for food because of school, but at least at school he's guaranteed a meal, so long as he doesn't throw up again, which he's starting to think he may not be able to rely on that, and that puts him in a precarious spot. He is not going to drop school to get food, but he can't go without food, so even if he has to sneak a fucking mouse or something in bag as his lunch and go eat it as an animal in the bathroom, so be it. Tonight he got lucky and managed to scare a passerby in front of his favorite alley into dropping their half-eaten cheeseburger. Just the smell of the fats and grease was enough to make him both ravenous and sick to his stomach at the same time. He dragged the fast food into the alley with his little feline teeth, feeling a bit guilty about scaring that person, but sheer delight outweighed it, and just started chowing down, his hunger winning out. He had finished about half the burger when a deep chuckle interrupted him. He jolted so hard he almost bolted, if it hadn't come from farther down the alley, aka his usual escape route, and if his stomach wasn't sticking to his spine right now, he would be halfway down the block already. Izuku's hair stood on end, an involuntary warning growl rumbling in his chest until the stranger stepped into the ambient light near the end of the alley. "Relax, buddy. It's just me. Mr. Eraserhead? So, this really is part of a new patrol route." His growl died in his throat. And maybe he should be concerned about how fast he relaxed, given that he knows barely anything about this full-grown man. But Eraserhead's a pro-hero and his teacher now, so can you really blame him? A soft, greeting meow stirred Izuku's throat as Eraserhead came closer and crouched. Normally Izuku doesn't let people touch him so much, but for some reason, he's made an exception for Mr. Eraserhead without making the conscious decision to do so. Is it because he's a hero? Because he's familiar? Or just because he knows from experience that Eraserhead knows how to pet cats? He's not sure, but when the man held his hand out in offering without just reaching to gingerly pet him, like always, he found himself walking over and letting cold fingers brush over his head, just the way his mom used to with his mop of green curls, and he didn't even bother to hide the happy, automatic purr that rumbled his chest. In the back of his mind, he noted that it's probably weird that his teacher is petting him when you think about it, but he doesn't actually feel as weird about it, so he dismissed it. And well, purring never lies. Plus, if Izuku wasn't okay with it, he'd just leave, and he knows Mr. Eraserhead wouldn't stop him if he just walked away, like a true cat. It feels nice though. So few things feel nice. Izuku hasn't thought about it before. But how long has it been since he's had human contact? That didn't involve competition or almost bashing his face on the ground? Cats are great and all, and keep him from getting lonely or from missing mom too much, but sometimes he forgets he's not actually a cat. Even if he can turn into animals, he's still a person. Since he started his UA path, from applying, to the entrance exam, to his first day, he's become more and more aware of it. His stutter has never been so bad, and he barely remembers how to interact like a normal person. His first day at school taught him that he's out of practice with people, and he was never very good at interacting with others in the first place. Honestly, it's amazing he can talk to others at all, but the only person who touched him that first day was Uraraka, and the contact was too brief to notice anything, and he was mortified and freaking out. He's spent so long as an animal surrounded by other animals that he forgot. Like not noticing you're cold until you touch something warm and suddenly you're freezing. He was vaguely aware of his tail flicking lazily as Eraserhead pet him, occasionally scratching under his chin or behind his ears, and unconsciously he turned and rubbed his itchy face against Eraserhead's callous palm. Shoyuta obliged the silent request, demand, and held the scruffy cat's face in his palms, rubbing his thumbs over his cheeks where it's the itchiest. It's unusual for a cat, or any animal, to ignore food in favor of attention, but just like that woman said, this stray seems to like him for some reason. The dirty feline sat right between his knees, purring, and he couldn't help the corner of his mouth tugging up from the warm feeling he always gets when he earns one of these stray bastards' trust. This one is particularly skittish of people, so if he feels a little smug about being the only person that he knows of who gets to pet him, that's Shuta's business. He doesn't even mind the dirt on his hands. Hizashi's expression when he left a nearly black handprint on his arm when he got home last time was priceless too. As funny as that was, he does wish he could give this little guy a bath. Somehow he doubts that would go well. This cat seems to enjoy being dirty, seeing as how cats are usually very clean creatures, meticulously grooming their fur and keeping it spick and span. Not this one. This one would rather be covered head to toe in whatever this oily black dirt is. Honestly, it looks like it rolled in a campfire pit with this greasy black powder having Cthulhu's short fur sticking out in every direction. Shoyuta reached into the inner pocket of his jumpsuit while he scratched the cat's chin and pulled a small pile of treats from it. This little guy will eat anything, seriously. There's a cheeseburger sitting over there, and he's seen it eat French fries and pizza and other stuff that is not good for cats before as he passed overhead on patrol. But these tasty pork chop treats and the tasty chicken flavor are this little guy's favorite. As if to prove just that, the moment the treats were free of his suit, the cat turned with laser focus to the food. The motion was disturbingly familiar. Especially with the green eyes, it gave him a wicked sense of déjà vu for something he'd seen just the other day in his new class. Suspicion whispered at the back of his ear. The urge to double-check crept up behind his eyes, his quirk pressing right up behind the threshold of activating, and sat there, waiting, while Shoyuta stewed over the possibility. Whether it's hero instinct, paranoia, or working with teenagers for too long, he's not sure. He sat on it for a long time as he watched the cat eat, and in the end he let it pass. He huffed a breath tinged with amusement, and let his quirk slip back to rest. "You remind me of someone." Hisashi, making fun of his infamous paranoia just a few hours ago, replayed in his head as he transferred the treats to his other hand and used his fingers to keep the cat from scarfing and making itself sick. He scratched between its shoulders while it happily snacked. The way it food guards is yet another curious twist to its behavior, and further evidence against this being an unruly teenager breaking quirk laws just to eat fast food out of the garbage. Seriously, he's even seen this cat killing mice and carrying them away. It'll let him pet it while it eats, but if he tries to take the food away or even looks at its food for too long, its fur starts to raise. Shoyuta is not willing to get scratched for that, so he avoids it. It's yet to growl at him though, which he'll take as another smug win. He let a few more treats from the recess of his palm fall closer to his fingers and hid a smile in his capture weapon when the cat's tail swished in delight each time more treats magically appeared in front of its nose. When the treats were finally gone, it looked around, sniffing his hand for more. It didn't lick the residue off his fingers like most cats, adding one more eccentricity onto the pile for Cthulhu. Cthulhu doesn't mind being dirty himself, but if other things are dirty, he'll take 2 or 3 more careful looks before deciding to eat it. He won't ever admit it, because he likes all cats, but the eccentric ones are his favorite. Shoyuta spent far too long sitting there, his ankles and calves aching from sitting on them after a long patrol that just started, and smearing this black dirt even further into the cat's fur in a veiled attempt to see if he could wipe it off, and maybe a little bit to see if his paranoia had a real foothold. But he couldn't bring himself to disturb the little guy too much, especially when a lazy tail settled over his steel-toed boots, flicking calmly as Cthulhu enjoyed the attention. He has a cloth in his utility belt, but even after wiping his hands, Hisashi's going to take one look at his nails and know exactly what he was doing on his patrol break. At least Shoyuta squeezed in a jelly pouch while he was petting. Unfortunately, as always, the much-needed cat time was interrupted by someone needing help in this neglected area of the city. It's a miracle that he actually got a near-full break. Things around here have definitely been getting better since he started patrolling. Word has gotten around that a hero is in the area again, so the more blatant crime is receding bit by bit. Once that's done, the villains he catches will be far more established criminals, and harder to dig out. Tonight it seems a simple purse snatcher is interrupting Izuku's human contact time, but as dedicated as ever, Eraserhead was off in a black blur, and for once Izuku didn't feel the need to chase after him. He wants to, of course, but filling his stomach with the rest of that cheeseburger takes priority, and he doesn't dare leave the food in the alley where it can be snatched the moment he takes a few too many steps away. Other animals wouldn't come near it when Eraserhead was here because people don't follow the laws of nature the way animals do, and are more dangerous by far. Most animals aren't bold enough to try and snatch something from a person and another animal, but just lil' old cat Izuku? That's a different story. He wolfed down the rest of the cheeseburger, wishing he could eat faster as a cat, but his mouth is small enough that he can only eat so much at a time, and his cat-sized stomach happily distended to make room for it all the same as he sat licking his claws clean before heading home. He spared a glance at the police cars that have conveniently cleared the street of pedestrians for him, and made his way past, careful to avoid drawing attention on his way home, even if it is dark and he looks like little more than a shadow. That night Izuku was once again plagued by anxiety nightmares, which had been happening a lot since the moment he applied for the entrance exam, and haven't stopped even though he's a student now. Tonight's feature was, unfortunately, the ocean. Specifically, the one and only time he ever dared venture into it. He sank into the restless land of dreams like a swimmer caught in a riptide. A slightly younger Izuku's cheeks puffed up as he forcefully sighed, pouring the last of the seawater from the old warped plastic bucket into the meter-deep hole he spent all of his Saturday morning digging. He set the bucket aside and glanced around for the umpteenth time. He knows nobody is here, it's a garbage beach for Pete's sake, but he can't help double and triple checking just to make sure when he's about to strip naked outdoors. He took another breath as he set his clothes aside on the ragged blanket he brought from Fukudashi's house. It's the closest thing to a towel he could find that wasn't disgusting or would be noticed it had gone missing. Izuku took another breath, staring down at the water before slowly dipping his feet in. A shiver raced up his body, skin prickling with goosebumps as he slowly immersed himself in the water, the cold climbing his legs all the way up to his waist before his feet finally settled in the sand at the bottom. He unconsciously held his hands and elbows above the water, standing stiff and trying not to let his teeth chatter for the few bitter seconds of adjusting. God, he hopes it won't still be this cold when he transforms. I hope this works. He pulled the overturned, broken plastic canoe over the hole. Call him paranoid, but after his dream, night terror last night of this experiment working and one of the cats finding him, he's taking precautions. When the hole was covered and the water had risen to his chest as he crouched under the muddy plastic, he took a deep breath in and held it, just in case. Here goes nothing. He closed his eyes. Please be a fish, please be a fish, be a fish, be a fish, be a fish. An image of a fish popped into his head and Izuku felt the world warp before water whooshed around him, the water rushing to fill the sudden gap where he'd been standing. He gasped on reflex, and immediately his lungs burned. Izuku choked, and his lungs seized, trying to drag another breath in, and the world warped again barely a few seconds after he transformed, and his arms were throwing off the canoe above the pit, and sent a warped clang ringing through the air as it bounced off some junk behind him. Human fingers dug into the sand as he scrambled out of the hole as fast as physics could possibly allow, hauling himself onto the beach with lungs on fire. He coughed so hard his throat sounded like an angry goose, but no matter how long he hacked, nothing came out. No water, nothing, but he felt like he just huffed corrosive chemical fumes. He laid on his arms, feet still in the water while he tried to breathe. He wasn't drowning, so what just happened? Several minutes passed with intermittent coughing before his lungs finally stopped hurting and Izuku just sat in the water because now that he's wet, it's colder outside of it, trying not to shiver as he tried to puzzle out what went wrong. He's pretty sure it worked, and he became a fish, so why did? Wait, what kind of fish did he do? What kind of fish was he thinking about? Izuku wanted to smack himself in the forehead, and buried his hands in his wet hair. That was a stupid mistake. Of course a freshwater fish is not going to be able to breathe in salt water. Stupid, 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 he could have drowned. Okay. Izuku took a deep breath again, coughing a little, and released his curl, briefly rubbing his stinging scalp. This time I'll make sure. He thought for several seconds, and he can think of quite a few fish, but he can't help second-guessing himself. What fish has he touched that he is absolutely certain is a saltwater fish? He's touched lots of fish when he was a kid and Mom took him to the aquarium with the touch tank, but he doesn't remember which fish he touched, if there even were saltwater tanks. He remembers touching a sea urchin and a starfish, but those are far from what he needs right now. He wrung his hands, sinking his mouth into the water, and blew out a rough sigh that produced a stream of tumultuous bubbles. Maybe a fish isn't the best idea. He touched lots of other things that live in the ocean during that visit. He just has to remember. Come on, brain, he wasn't that young, it wasn't so long ago that he shouldn't be able to remember. He has to remember something, and he did remember. He remembered a lot of things, but none of them were animals. All that was coming to mind made his chest ache more fiercely than nearly drowning could ever even dream to achieve. A happy smile, bright green eyes, warm hands holding him around the middle so he didn't fall as he leaned over the edge of the tank and gently poked at things. Soft surrounding hugs and the smell of his mother's shampoo that he no longer remembers the name or brand of. His eyes stung and he coughed again. A clatter had him looking over and watching the black streak that is either Heather or Hunter tearing off into the ether to be back who knows when. He actually thought all the cats were gone already, but he guesses one of them was hiding or stalking something. The distraction was welcome though, even if it had made him jolt. He chewed on his lips, worrying the flesh between his teeth as he racked his brain with renewed focus, steadfastly avoiding the pitfall he'd fallen into before. But the salty fishy taste of seawater leaking into his mouth from the action and the lingering ache of his mistakes and memories had him hesitating long enough to consider if it's really worth it. But he cast a look at the water between towering stacks of garbage, and a timely growl of his stomach reminded him that this isn't just experimenting with his quirk, or alleviating his own curiosity about what he's capable of. There could be so much food out there just beyond the sand his and the Clouders' food troubles could be solved. Best case scenario, he could even catch enough for them to eat every day that he can start experimenting with bigger transformations. When has he ever gotten anything without a great deal of struggle before? He can't give up yet just because he fumbled the first experiment. Izuku allowed himself a whimper and a petulant, whiny groan, blowing out a burst of aggressive bubbles that nearly got water in his eyes. Wait a second. The water sloshed as he jerked upright with widened eyes. There are things that live in the ocean but also breathe air. He won't have to worry about drowning if he chooses something that can do both. The aquarium isn't the only place he's touched sea life. He got pinched by a crab as a kid and cried for 3 hours. That's perfect. He needs to know if he can convert his respiratory system to something else. Especially after the fish test he just did, because on the off chance that it isn't an issue of freshwater versus saltwater but actually that he can't breathe underwater despite his shifting physiology suggesting that he should be able to. Quirks are weird and their rules hardly ever make good sense, then he needs to know. It would be one of the first hard limits he's found for his quirk, and it would change his plans drastically if that's the case. That could affect how he uses his quirk for the rest of his life. In that same vein, he's not sure if he can do an invertebrate either. He's only ever done vertebrates, things that breathe air, and mostly mammals so far, but this could be a chance to test 2, 3 things at once. He's not sure if it's the smartest idea to test multiple things simultaneously, but he can't think of any obvious reasons not to, and honestly it sounds more efficient to cross off as many questions as he can with as little transforming as possible. He has limited energy after all. If he's gonna be a hero, he needs to know everything he can about his quirk as fast as he can know it. He has to catch up to kids who have been using their quirks their entire lives, so it only makes sense to do whatever he can think of to speed up that process without crippling or killing himself. And preferably, breaking as few laws as possible. He's long accepted that in order to survive he has to break a few, and he's long rationalized his actions. Not even police and heroes follow the law to the letter 24/7. From what he's seen, everybody breaks the law on occasion, even by accident. That doesn't mean he likes doing it, or that it doesn't chafe his conscience and make him paranoid about being caught and ruining his chances of becoming a hero. Truth be known, if he thought he had a reasonable chance of not being forced to do worse just by living in Fukudashi's house, if he hadn't started questioning his chances of surviving long enough to apply for UA, he would have toughed out being in the house instead of running like he did. There's not a day that he doesn't worry he'll be caught or turned in, sent back, and even prosecuted for public quirk usage. But he didn't have any other choice when he made the decision, and to be fair, he didn't know he was going to be breaking quirk usage laws at all, much less on a daily basis. At the end of the day, he can't think of any better ideas, no matter how many nights he lies awake thinking in circles, feeling guilty, or how many nightmares he has about being caught, about the things that have happened or that he's done. He never thought he would rather deal with being eaten alive by anxiety every day than to live with the torment of others. He should be well used to both, but he didn't even know it was possible to prefer this constant burning gnaw in his gut. That's different from the stabbing sinkhole of his empty stomach, over anything else. Izuku shook his head, flinging water and sand from his frizzy curls, and slapped his cheeks with wet hands that are starting to wrinkle. Enough of that. Enough. There's no point thinking about it, it'll come back later anyway, he's got stuff to do right now. With that self-pep talk, Izuku gave his distorted reflection a resolute nod. Let's try it. He took in a careful breath, and slowly immersed himself in the cold water again. If he's already underwater, it might reduce the disorientation from transforming, and he won't just plunk into tumultuous water and panic gasp again. Once his butt hit the sandy bottom, he started his mantra of wishing. He expected it to take longer because it took so long to change into the fish, but this time it happened the same as it does when he wants to be a cat. With the clear image of the angry little baby crab hanging from his childhood hand in mind, the world warped for a split second and Izuku found himself sitting on the bottom with the urge to blink at what just happened, but he couldn't blink. Nothing burns, not even his eyes, even though he's underwater. It was a very strange experience, but that wasn't the strangest part. Moment of truth. Izuku looked around and was hit with a massive wave of vertigo. His eyes being in different places than he's used to was hard to get used to. He's never taken a panoramic photo, but he's seen plenty, and this right here is some inbuilt panoramic tripping hazard that made him feel a sort of heady nausea that settled in his brain instead of his stomach. It was one of the oddest experiences of his life as it settled into a pseudo-normal but wider field of vision than he's used to than can be achieved by animals whose eyes are inside their skulls. He felt like it should be making him dizzy, and the fact that it isn't was a whole new level of disconcerting. It took a minute to figure out how to move, like playing a video game with reversed controls. Just like with his cat transformation, his thoughts, or rather preferences, changed a little bit. The idea of being in the air is neither appealing nor unappealing anymore, but the thought of leaving this covered hole feels risky. It feels risky to go out into the open, but also risky to stay here for too long. It's an odd feeling, because he knows he's perfectly safe here in this hole. That's why he made it the way he did. Speaking of, this hole is bigger than he thought, and he feels like it should be darker in here, but it's very ambient and blurry. Trying to blink resulted in unconsciously moving his hands to brush over his eyes, and he startled himself. It wasn't as squishy as he would have expected, it felt a bit like stiff jelly. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. With his deep green color blending him into the algae-covered rocks like natural camouflage, he spent a while eating said algae off said rocks and metal junk. Algae has a weird flavor, but it's not unpleasant, at least to a crab. He can already tell, though, that this would not be enough to sustain him. He'd have to spend all day eating this, and a crab's stomach just isn't big enough for that to be a practical source of food, and the seagulls around are making him nervous. He feels exposed with them hovering, made worse by his lack of knowledge on whether or not seagulls eat crabs like him, and he can't see them well enough to determine if they look hungry or are about to swoop down. All he can tell is they're nearby, and frankly, that's more than enough. He's not willing to tempt fate. A weird anxiety began to churn up inside him, like his body remembered something horrible but his mind didn't, and deep down he knew why, but there was no room for conscious thought or control in this place. The sliver of lucidity that knew how this ended, that knew what was coming, slipped away like the darting minnows in the sea beside him. The sliding of time and twisting of space like oil on a bar of soap went unnoticed as he was suddenly on the rocks like he'd been there for a long time already, spotting some sizable fish in the water. He decided to venture in to see if he could catch one or two, driven almost entirely by his stomach and thoughts of the clouder munching down on as much fish as they wanted. Everything inside of him screamed not to go into the water, but his body kept moving along, happy as could be and up for the challenge of catching the fantastical rainbow fish taunting him. A large cat with stormy gray and white fur woke up and peered at Izuku's sleeping form with piercing jade-green eyes, pupils slitted to nothing more than a thin line as the human boy's real body jerked, beads of sweat rolling down his face, powerless to stop his past/dream self from going into the water. It took Izuku a long time and many failures before his crab self actually managed to catch a fish, but catching it was the easy part. It was a hard fight to keep a hold of it, squeezing his claws around its slippery scales until it finally wiggled for the last time. He was exhausted and ecstatic, unable to help stretching the fish above him, flailing his prey around in triumph. Heedless of the shrieking sense of danger, of his own mind telling him to stop moving, begging it's going to notice him. This fish, he is certain, is a saltwater fish, which means he'll be able to retry his fish transformation safely. His celebration was short-lived. As he climbed out of the water dragging the fish, finally obeyed the overpowering urge to scramble out as quickly as he could, but it was too late. The tentacles lunged for him, and he saw the dark beak thrust from between a fleshy maw of S******. Oh! Izuku jerked awake with a scream, nearly punting a cat across the floor. The lingering image of his memory turned nightmare in front of his eyes. Cats sprung from their places, bursting like the lights of a firework and shooting to every edge of the cat house in a frenzy. The few that got trapped or stayed to investigate the source stood staring at him with backs arched and fur bristled to the sky, high whines of alarm and eyes like pinpricks. Izuku kicked and flailed in a blind panic, thrashing to get free from his ratty blanket prison and scramble away until his back hit the wall with a reverberating metal clang. His hands flew over his skin, his chest heaving faster than the beat of a hummingbird's wings, eyes wide and struggling to adjust to the darkness as they flew around the room. Every breath came as a gasp, his lungs barely able to inflate before the air was rushing out again as his fingers dug into his front ribs, intent on trying to physically grasp his heart behind the bone cage to stop it from hammering, until he finally recognized his surroundings. The cat house. He's awake and in the cat house, far away from the rocks and the water. Izuku's hands shook like he was walking in a snowstorm without gloves as he struggled to get his breaths under control. Hyperventilating would only make it harder to prevent a panic attack, and despite being clear-headed and able to consciously take deeper and slower breaths, he was already in its throes. With every bit of calm, came an equal measure of shaking until he was swiping salty tears and sweat from his face, and he had several cats approaching him with decreasing alarm and worried meows, furry heads and bodies bumping up against him, trying to suss out what was wrong / if he was hurt. Izuku finally untucked his knees enough from where he'd curled up and released his stinging scalp from cramping fingers to allow a cat, or two, into his lap. He wrapped his arms around Frosting and Colby, forever thankful that they don't mind being squeezed. The rest of the Clouder was a little too huffy with him for cuddles, but concerned enough that they were sitting nearby with sharp eyes. Only the laziest of the lot, Sweet Pea, was laying down again, right next to Izuku's hip as she rarely strays far from the warmest thing in the room. Which so happens to be him most of the time. There are so many kinds of Quirks out there, so many that can do horrifying and surreal things, but nothing in this world will ever be more harrowing than something trying to eat you alive. Whether that's an animal, a Quirk, or whatever else the universe can come up with. And Izuku is pretty certain that, for him at least, that will never change. He shuffled his feet a little, sinking further against the wall and stroked the cats around him with methodical absence, letting the roaring rumbles of the cuddliest and most protective cats soothe the trembles from his body, bleeding the stress from his bones until he was utterly exhausted. His eyes feel heavy, but he can already tell he won't be going back to sleep. The adrenaline made sure of that. He buried his face in Colby's fur, blocking out everything he could. If he can't sleep, he can at least rest, but even that was beyond his reach as his brain just wouldn't stop. He does not like the ocean and can barely bring himself to go near it as anything but a human anymore, not even when he's starving, and he still trembles and has to survey it carefully before he touches it. The most he'll do is collect some algae in a bucket as a person when the tide is out and put it in his seawater hole to make safe before he transforms to eat. The only consolation of that day is the octopus transformation he picked up. He leaned his head back on the wall with a soft thunk as Frosting got up and wandered out of the cat house, apparently ready to start his day. "Maybe I should consider using it." The soft mumble drifted through the quiet space, barely audible over the various pockets of purring in the room. His seawater hole is still there. It's been a long time since that happened. He doesn't have to go anywhere near the ocean this time. He's not afraid of water, thank God, but the ocean. He said in a forceful breath. How can he be a hero if he's afraid of the ocean? He doesn't believe for even a second that there won't be aquatic training of some kind at UA. It would be foolish not to train heroes to, at the very least, be strong swimmers capable of water rescues. Training for swimming against an ocean current, or a riptide isn't a far stretch from that, and those being the most dangerous kind of waters, are of course the kind that people would need to be rescued from. Flashes of a tan/black beak crunching and slashing off of moss-green shell flitted across his mind. The squish's tentacles wrapped around him, pulling, suckers sticking like an industrial suction cup. His arms tightened around Colby. Just the idea of tentacles is enough to make him tense, and a lump form in his throat. Would it be different if it's his body? Will it help if it's his beak and his tentacles? Or would it be just as terrifying as feeling them wrap around him, pulling his pinchers and legs back until he couldn't move, trying to lock him in place with no ability to resist as a sharp beak dug through his shell to tear pieces out of him like a living bento? What would have happened if the octopus had gotten his leg in its mouth first? Would it have bitten it clean off and removed one of his fingers or toes? Or worse, his entire limb? A full-body shiver raced through him. His toes curled as he squeezed them closer to his body, his fingers following suit in fists with the urge to protect them. No. He's gotten into UA now, and he doesn't want to let this hang over his head anymore. If he doesn't push this boundary at UA, when he finally has the time and resources to do something about it, then when will he? Will he wait until someone's life is in his hands to take the plunge? In a mirror image of his nightmare, Izuku finished pouring the last bucket and set it aside before sinking his feet into the water. He hissed through his teeth at the cold, fighting off shivers that raced up his legs like the water was trying to send ice bolts straight to his core. Colby meowed, long and low and a touch dramatic before he switched his tail in what Izuku likes to think of as exasperation and began to stalk off for his own day, seeing as Izuku won't go back to the cat house and be his pillow any longer. Izuku rolled his eyes fondly, his nerves dissipating a little, and moved to pull the protective cover over the hole. He blew out a slow breath, watching the water surface ripple when it had only just settled again. It's okay, it's okay. He can do this. He can do this, he can do this. With hands curled into the sand rim and teeth on the verge of chattering, he sucked a deep breath in and unconsciously held it as he closed his eyes, and made the wish that triggers a new transformation. In a flash of racing feeling through his body and a moment of disorientation, he found himself with his eyes open again as his eyelids disappeared. He sat on the bottom waiting. For what? He wasn't sure exactly, but for the amount of emotional turmoil he went through all these years over this transformation, it was kind of anticlimactic. He feels, not really warmer at being fully submerged, but like there's a lack of cold. He gave his limbs an experimental wiggle, and 8 squishy curling arms responded, the suckers moving, feeling along the sand, feeling out the holes that his feet made where he's still sitting, and sensing the water around him in general like it was second nature. Equal parts excitement and terror skittered through Izuku's veins, and he froze as his arms wiggled on their own in response. That's going to take some getting used to. Looking at his tentacles, anxiety turned towards curiosity as his green skin began to change to a light tan, matching the sand around him, and already he feels safer being disguised. He hesitantly tried moving around and, as usual, it took a minute to get the hang of it, but thankfully moving as a new animal always seems to be somewhat instinctual. He's yet to find one where he couldn't move naturally after a couple minutes of adjusting to the shape. He got in the groove of just crawling around the bottom before attempting to swim around, and he surprised himself with the sudden jerk of movement. He moves so fast. He's not used to so little water resistance when swimming, even as the crab. It was a little hard to control where he was going, but once he did, he took to it like, well, a fish to water. It was almost as fun as his first time walking around as a cat. He feels a little silly for being scared of this for so long, but he can't bring himself to say he didn't have good reason. Izuku sighed and startled himself as it came out as a little puff of water somewhere beside his head. He's pretty sure it came from the siphon, the thing used for respiration, waste disposal, and ink discharge, but it's strange to feel it on his head instead of his chest, which he doesn't even have in this form. It took a while to notice, until he looked up at the cover over his hole, actually, but everything is a bit of a strange color. Like it's all desaturated and ebbing towards blobby shapes, but not fuzzy like he needs glasses. The edges are crisp and sharp and the shapes of things are remarkably discernible. He knew octopus are colorblind, but he wasn't sure if he would be when transformed. After his experience with the tiger at the entrance exam, he really doesn't know what to make of this. This is the third time he's transformed, two of which were new transformation, but the other wasn't, and he's had vision issues. Okay, not issues exactly, but differences. The tiger, he was definitely red-green colorblind, but just like the rabbit afterwards, this time it's like his vision is a mix of his human normal and octopus normal. He's going to have to experiment more with this later after he has some time to think about ways to test that won't cost him too much time. He has homework to do now in the evenings, in addition to his late-night hunting, and today was a fluke getting up this early. He's already hoping he doesn't start dragging his feet towards the end of the day. He really can't afford that. He shook his head and his arms wiggled. He'll think about it later. At least he can check 3 things off his long list of questions about his quirk. Yes, he gets all features and possibly all detriments of a creature. Yes, it's different when it's his own body. And yes, he can probably do all invertebrates, not just crustaceans or things that have solid forms and or bones. That means there's a good chance he can turn into just about anything as long as he's touched part of it. That makes him even more curious, practically burning with it about things like, can he transform into things he's eaten, or does the cooking process change it so his quirk doesn't recognize it as a living thing? And can he turn into things that once existed, but don't anymore? This octopus he has is small, and he's not sure if it's just him, or the actual type of octopus. He's not too sure on the exact species of this octopus either. Maybe he should do some research at school. He knows that some octopus secrete toxins from their skin, so that would be a very good thing to know before he uses this around other people, especially in class or as a hero. A bigger octopus would be better too. He can't exactly do a water rescue with a form this form, but a giant octopus would be able to. He's been able to do big things so far, but never for long, and he always ends up as something smaller if he doesn't change back in time. He's a little worried that if he passes out, the smaller form won't be suitable for water, or the type of water he's in at least, or if he'll become a land creature or something that needs to constantly be motioned to survive and end up drowning because of it. Drowning on the 10th of never, please. He has to become a hero before he can drown, and preferably not even after that. Total avoidance would be best. Ships in the night, if you catch his drift. Speaking of drowning, octopus can survive out of the water. His eyes turned up to the cover again, and the little sliver he left to allow air circulation and to keep track of time. What was once the barest hint of daylight when he started has finally turned the sky light enough that he can tell he needs to get out and get ready for school soon. Well, he doesn't really fancy the cold from when he got in, and if he has to get out anyway, he might as well test one last thing, right? With no predators around or awake at this hour, and half the cats already gone to start their days early, he feels a little more daring to venture out of the water and test his capabilities on land. With one propulsion of his tentacles he swam to the surface, and he was taken aback by how easy it was to slither himself up onto the sand and squish himself through the tiny crack without trouble. It didn't even feel that weird. Just like when he pulls his shoulders in to make himself appear smaller as a person. The only difference is that he actually did make himself smaller as an octopus. The sand feels a little odd out of the water, but not unpleasant like he was expecting. He can't breathe the air, but it's surprising that it doesn't bother him to be out in it either. It only started to bother him when his skin began to dry out slithering through the sand, so he slipped back into the water and cleaned off before trying again. One more try turned into a few more times until he was coming back out of the water again, and a seagull shrieked above him. His heart jumped out of his chest, and he got a mouthful of sand as he found himself naked on the beach like the Little Mermaid, with only the dislodged cover for his seawater hole keeping his modesty. He coughed and sputtered, spitting sand and didn't care about the taste as he plunged his hands into the seawater from his hole to rinse the grit out of his teeth. But the moment the water hit his tongue, he coughed and spit and accidentally swallowed a little of both. He scrambled up and made a beeline for the cat house, quickly finding his water bottle that he had the divine sense to fill up in the park on his way home from school yesterday, and wasted nearly half of it gagging and trying to get the taste out of his mouth. By the time he was done at throwing up, his stomach growled. With all the enthusiasm of a tired college student, he toweled himself off as best he could and got ready for school. A little bubble of happiness formed in his chest at his accomplishment, easing the anxiety of doing something that legitimately terrified him, and an idea suddenly struck him. He could turn that hole into his own little titapool if he just adds some algae and rocks and stuff and lets it grow. Then he wouldn't need to go into the ocean. He barely resisted the urge to do a little jump and fist pump as he made his way through the sparse crowd of early risers. He can also stop getting up at the crack of dawn to head out. He has never been someone super attached to their sleep, but he's not really a morning person either. At least not enough to enjoy getting up that early. He's enjoyed being up late more and more lately, and has trouble going to sleep when he should. He just doesn't get tired enough to sleep until close to midnight, even if he's exhausted. A big yawn forced his jaw as wide as it could go, his tongue unconsciously curling as he did, and he stretched a little as UA slowly appeared on the horizon.